Alright, so I wanted to do a couple more experiments with this, and for this first one what I wanted to do was to eliminate the bearing drag as a factor as much as possible. So what I've done is I've cleaned the bearings and I've put in a high performance oil instead of the thick grease it had in there before, and now the wheels spin, you know, I don't know, so much better. So now I just want to see if it still feels slow or not, or if it feels just as fast as a four-wheeled board. So I've taken it up a little higher this time and I'm just going to write it down. Alright, so that was not as fast as a longboard, but it's definitely a lot faster than it was. So before, it just kind of felt like it was bogged down, almost like the tires were flat, but they weren't flat. Now it just feels like you're riding on pneumatic tires, so it's a little slower because of that. But I couldn't say if it's how it compares to just four wheels. It feels very, very similar to that experience now. So that, I think, is a success. So after this, I don't think having a bunch of wheels is really necessarily going to make it slow anymore. As long as you have good bearings, they're in good condition, and they're free spinning, and they got some good oil in them. Alright, so what I've done this time is I've scooched the wheels all together so they're not free spinning. It's acting like one big wheel that moves together. So I want to see how that affects the turning and the feel. Alright, so that was pretty interesting. The handling, I really didn't feel like there was a difference so much. Not that I could tell. So whatever difference was there was really subtle. What was not subtle at all was its effect on the speed, particularly when in turns. So this thing was really slow again. I'd say it is even slower than it was before. When I did my first run on this. And not only that, it also started to squeak when I was turning. So these wheels are just butted up against each other. And so they're free to move relative to each other a little bit if they slide on each other. And so it was, I think the squeaking was just when it was doing that. So I think the takeaway is the wheels are going to need to roll at different speeds, and they're going to do it regardless. So either they're going to rub against each other or torque this rubber or something to make that happen, or one of the wheels is just going to be scrubbing on the pavement and dumping energy into the pavement that way. So not having the wheel spin independently, really big drag on speed during the turns, which is actually really interesting when you think about longboards, because longboard wheels are wider wheels. So look at this, you know, that's a pretty wide patch that it's trying to engage with the pavement. When you compare with the patch on the pneumatic tire, if it's just one tire you're looking at, the patch is just that, you know, centimeter wide strip along the center of the wheel. So this is the contact patch, this is the contact patch, and this is the contact patch that's relevant when you're on pavement. none of these knobs or anything are ever going to do anything unless the wheel is side loading and piling up something for that to bite into, or if it's sinking just a little bit into the dirt and dust or mud or whatever you're in. So, but when on pavement, you don't sink in at all. You just stay right on top, and you're only using the very top of this tire surface. So maybe that could be something to mess around with at some point. Taking two side set wheels, mounting them really close together as if they're one wheel, but letting them roll independently from each other, and seeing what that does. Anyway, yeah, that's the biggest takeaway there, is the rolling speed and how much speed it lost during turns. Going straight, I'd say I couldn't tell if it was losing speed at all relative to what it was doing before going straight, but I will say even just doing subtle turns and just basic maneuvering, not just hard carving, was causing it to lose speed. So it was definitely a pretty immediate effect for any turning at all. Alright, so this last experiment I want to do involves, again, the bearings. So, with the bearings, what you've got is, you've got this rubber seal that's in it, and the rubber seal, it presses into a groove that's in the outer race. And then it extends to the inner race, and it just kind of hugs it a little bit. In fact, it hugs it so lightly that there's even a little bit of a gap. If you hold the bearing up to the light, usually you can see some light gets through the shield, or the seal, and the inner race. The grease in a bearing can fill up that gap, and the grease just kind of shears in place, and so it kind of becomes a moving liquid viscous barrier that stops anything from really getting into the bearing. But I've washed out the grease of all these bearings, and now I just have that oil in there, and the oil is not thick enough to maintain a seal like the grease has. So I've been thinking about ways that I can protect the bearings on my mountain board, especially since the conditions that these things ride in is just way worse than anything on a street board. So this is what I've come up with here. You can see that really well. So I think of it sort of like a speed ring. So it's kind of got this thicker section here. It's 1 millimeter thick, and it's got this thicker section out at the rim that's the same height, and it's got this thinner area in the middle, and that kind of makes it so it's a little bit more flexible, and so that pressure on the inside isn't necessarily all going to be transferred to pressure on the outside. So the idea with this is you can tighten it down right over your bearing, and it tightens down on the inner race, and it's just going to very slightly touch on the outer race. But what I'm doing there is I've got a gap here on this speed ring shield thing, and then the gap in the bearing seal is all the way on the other side, on the inner race side. So I'm basically creating distance that dust and dirt and or water or anything needs to travel, and because these are moving different speeds relative to each other, I'm hoping that there's going to be some kind of centrifugal motion or influence going on to keep stuff from going inward in this gap that there exists there. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to try, but I just spent all this effort making sure that this bearing is going to spin freely and roll fast and carry speed. And with this, I'm going to introduce some more friction to that, and I really would rather not do that. So I think something like this could be a really good solution for like e-skate, where you've got power and you're not really concerned with that. But I made another variant here, which is the exact same thing, except I've just chopped off this outer section. So this one goes on, and it just covers the inner race and the seal, and it's got a little bit more of a gap to make sure that it doesn't touch. But it basically does the same thing, and it makes it so that any dust or dirt or whatever is going to have to get through a much more restricted path before it can get into the bearing. So, what my experiment is going to be is, so on my board, on each axle, you've got the inner wheel, the middle wheel, and then the outer wheel. And what I'm going to do, on the inner wheel, I'm not going to change anything at all. It's just going to have the plain bearings as is right now. On the middle wheel, I'm going to have these smaller shields that I printed off. And you're going to see how those work. And the outer, I'm going to have the larger full contact shields that I printed off. So these don't touch, these are no contact, these are contact. And then there's no shields at all. That's the experiment I want to do. And I'm going to set up my board today, and I'm just going to have to come back after a while, after the dunes. I'm going to leave it on. So we'll see if any of these make any sort of difference in allowing dust and dirt and water or whatever from getting into the bearings. So we'll have to get back to that, but for now, Longboard Technology, over and out.